Behind the flashing screens of the global stock market, beyond the grand neoclassical architecture of central banks, and beneath the complex political maneuvers of world leaders, there lies a narrative that spans centuries. Most of us are taught to think of history as a chaotic series of random events, wars that break out by accident, revolutions fueled by spontaneous anger, and economic booms that appear out of nowhere. But what if there was a consistent thread connecting the major shifts of the last 250 years? What if certain names have appeared in the ledgers of every significant global transition since the late 18th century? Today, we are going deep into the history of the dynasties that didn't just participate in the world economy. They built the very pipes through which wealth flows. From the cramped, dimly lit streets of Frankfurt to the towering glass skyscrapers of modern Manhattan, this is the story of the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and the evolution of global power. The journey begins in the 1760s in Frankfurt, Germany. At this time, the city was a hub of trade, but for the Jewish population, life was restricted to a single narrow street known as the Judengasse. In this environment of extreme pressure, Mayer Amschel Rothschild lived in a house marked by a red shield, Zum Roten Schild. Mayer was not a man of vast inheritance, but he possessed a mind that saw the future of capital. He understood that while kings fought for land, the real prize was the control of the money that funded those conquests. Mayer started as a dealer in rare coins, gaining the trust of Crown Prince Wilhelm of Hesse. But he knew that a local business was a vulnerable business. To protect the family's future, he drafted a family constitution, a set of laws that demanded absolute unity and secrecy. His greatest strategic masterstroke was his 5 sons. He realized that by spreading his bloodline across the continent, he could create a web that no single revolution or war could destroy. Amschel, the eldest, stayed in Frankfurt to maintain the ancestral center. Salomon was sent to Vienna, where he would eventually become the financier to the Habsburgs. Nathan, perhaps the most brilliant of the 5, headed to London, the rising heart of the British Empire. Kalman went to Naples to manage the finances of the Italian peninsula, and Jakob, known as James, settled in Paris, where he would become a titan of the French economy. This was the birth of the 5 arrows, symbolizing the strength found in unity. They created the first truly international banking system. While the rest of the world relied on slow government mail, the Rothschild brothers operated a private network of high-speed couriers, coded messages, and carrier pigeons. They weren't just moving money, they were moving information. In a world where news traveled at the speed of a horse, the Rothschilds lived in a world of tomorrow, knowing the outcomes of treaties and battles days before the heads of state. The year 1815 marked the apex of this advantage. Europe was a battlefield, and the Duke of Wellington was facing off against Napoleon at Waterloo. Nathan Rothschild had funded the British war effort, literally smuggling gold across borders to ensure the soldiers were paid. When Napoleon was defeated, Nathan's couriers reached London 24 hours before the official government dispatches. The legend tells us that Nathan entered the London Stock Exchange and, with a calculated look of despair, began to sell his government bonds. The market, assuming Nathan knew of a British defeat, collapsed in a panic. At the absolute bottom of that crash, Nathan's agents moved in and bought the entire market for pennies on the pound. When the news of victory arrived the next day, the Rothschilds didn't just have a fortune. They owned a significant portion of the British national debt. This turned the Rothschilds into the bankers to the world. They revolutionized the way nations operated by perfecting the sovereign bond market. Instead of a king simply taxing his people to death, he would now borrow from the bankers, using the future labor of his citizens as collateral. This system ensured that the bankers remained the ultimate authority. For no matter who won a war, the debt remained, and the interest had to be paid. As the 19th century reached its peak, the family financed the world's infrastructure. They funded the Suez Canal, the great railways of France and Austria, and the mining of gold and diamonds in South Africa. They were the invisible hand behind the expansion of the British Empire, providing the capital that made global colonialism possible. But as the 20th century dawned, the focus of power began to shift across the Atlantic. In the United States, a new era of industrial titans was emerging. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870 with a single-minded goal: total control. Rockefeller didn't just want to participate in the oil market, he wanted to eliminate competition entirely. By 1890, he controlled 90% of the oil in America. Rockefeller understood that if the 19th century belonged to those who controlled money, the 20th century would belong to those who controlled energy. He used his vast wealth to influence politics, education, and medicine, creating a legacy that extended far beyond the oil fields. Simultaneously, J.P. Morgan was consolidating the American financial system. Morgan was so influential that he famously bailed out the U.S. Treasury during the Panic of 1895, and again in 1907. These events proved to the elites that the American economy was too large to be managed by the government alone. It needed a central bank. In November of 1910, a group of the world's most powerful men traveled in secret to Jekyll Island, Georgia. Among them were representatives of the Rockefeller and Morgan interests and Paul Warburg, a descendant of a German banking dynasty. They drafted a plan for a central banking system that would be private in its ownership, but public in its appearance. This became the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The creation of the Federal Reserve gave a handful of banking interests the power to print the world's reserve currency, the US dollar. This was the ultimate evolution of Mayer Amschel's vision. The power was no longer in the hands of individuals, but in the hands of a system that could expand or contract the economy at will, influencing interest rates and the very value of the money in your pocket. As the world moved through two devastating world wars, the nature of this dynastic power changed again. High taxes and public scrutiny made the visible ownership of wealth dangerous. The great families began to move their assets, into a labyrinth of foundations, trusts, and holding companies. These institutions were tax-exempt and shielded from the public eye, allowing the wealth to grow silently and pass from generation to generation without being dismantled. Today, we live in the era of institutionalized power. If you look at the major corporations that dominate our world, from technology and pharmaceuticals to energy and the media, you will find the same names at the top of the shareholder lists. But they aren't family names. They are the names of massive asset management firms: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. These big three firms manage tens of trillions of dollars, a sum larger than the GDP of most nations. They are the largest shareholders in nearly every company in the S&P 500. While these are public firms, the question of who ultimately controls them leads back into a web of private wealth and cross-corporate ownership that is nearly impossible to untangle. The dynastic wealth of the 19th century hasn't vanished. It has simply evolved into a permanent, institutionalized system of global governance. So, we must ask, do these families and institutions rule the world? The answer is more complex than a simple yes or no. It is not about a group of men sitting in a secret room deciding every detail of your life. It is about the control of the infrastructure of our civilization. It is about the power to decide how money is created, how energy is priced, and how information is distributed. The Rothschilds taught us that unity and information are the keys to longevity. The Rockefellers taught us that the control of resources is the key to dominance. And the modern financial era has taught us that in the age of data, power is found in the platforms and algorithms that manage the world's wealth. We move through a world that was designed long before we were born. We earn their currency, we use their energy, and we consume their information. As we move toward a future of digital currencies, central bank digital IDs, and globalized shifts, the principles of the 5 arrows remain as relevant as ever.